Our study tonight is lesson 11, and we're getting into a two-part study of how to develop self-discipline. Of course, Jesus, you recall, and this is the verse of which we have taken our entire series of studies from, is Mark chapter 8 and verse 34, where Jesus said, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." So this study has been about learning to deny self. And another way of saying that is learning to control self. Or yet another way of saying it is learning to master ourselves. All of those terms are certainly appropriate for us to understand what Jesus is saying when he says that if we come after him, we need to deny self. We have seen that God commands self-denial. It's not an option. It's not something that we can choose from it and other things. It's what it is. It is not an option. It is a command. And neither is it a suggestion, meaning that, it would be advisable if you would do this. No, it is not a suggestion. It is a command. And we need to treat it as we are so emphatic in treating other commands that God has given, whether it's commands pertaining to the plan of salvation, whether it's commands pertaining to the work of the church, the worship of the church, the organization of the church. It's just as much of a command for us as Christians to deny ourselves as it is any command that God has given us. So it's a command. I hope that that's been emphasized all throughout this study. And we have seen that we must suppress our will and put God's will first at all times. Not sometimes, not most of the time, but we must put God's will first in our lives all of the time. We've also seen in our study that meekness is a big part of denying ourselves. And we have seen how, and we have seen when, that we need to apply meekness in our lives. And two, we have looked at the principle of temperance. We've looked at temperance and how that it applies to all areas of our lives. Not just a few, not just most, but all. Temperance is to be had and exercised in all areas of our life. So what we want to do in this lesson and didn't think I had that. We want to look at this lesson and the next. We want to study how we can develop self-discipline. How do we develop it? What are the things that are essential for us to do in order to be self-disciplined, in order to deny self? So that's what we want to look at in this lesson and in our next lesson as well. One way that we develop self-discipline is that we begin with an I can attitude. Jesus has asked something of major importance in Mark 8 and verse 34. If we're going to come after him, we're going to have to deny self. So it is then that we have to, in order to develop this denying self, have the attitude that I can. It's a big command to feel. It's not a minor thing, and I think surely in all of the lessons, in the previous 10 lessons that we've looked at, I hope that we see that we're not dealing with an easy subject here. It's a very hard subject. So we must understand that as difficult as it is, and like we said, when it comes to controlling self in certain areas, some of us have less of a problem than others, some of us have more of a problem than others. So, but we all have our problems in one or more areas when it comes to controlling ourselves. But it's important, in order to develop this, to have an I can attitude. I can deny myself. It was the Apostle Paul. He had an I can. Someone read us Philippians 4 and verse 13. I'll just take volunteers tonight.
I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
I can. That's what Paul said. I can. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And we know that that statement is not an all-inclusive statement when it comes to all things. He's not talking about all things wicked, sinful, evil. I can do all things. No, he's not talking about that. The all things here is restricted. It's limited. And we see that in the context. Let's turn the Bibles over to Philippians, the 4th chapter. We read verse 13. Let's go back up to verse 11. And I'm reading tonight from the King James. Verse 11, Philippians 4. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And then verse 13, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. So what we're seeing here in the context is that Paul is saying that he can do. I can do all that God expects of me to do. He says I can live with or I can live without some of the pleasures of life. He says I can abound and I can be abased. So what we're seeing here is that in application of what we're talking about here, we learn that we can fulfill any command, and get that on the screen. We can fulfill any command. We can bear any trial. We can perform any duty. We can meet any temptation, and we can live in any circumstance with Christ. But I want us to go back at these verses and look again as we read verses 11 and 12 again. Not that I speak in respect of want, for what's the next three letters, three words? I have learned. Now look at verse 12. I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. I'm instructed both to be full let's see, maybe I'm reading. Yeah, I was looking at the New King James. Who's got that?
Everywhere,
Read verse 12.
I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need.
There it is again. I have learned. In both of those verses. See, Paul had to learn. It wasn't automatic. And it's not automatic for you and me to deny self, to be content in whatever state that we're in. It has to be learned. I have learned. So this attitude is not automatic. It's not, it doesn't, like magic, just happen. Like anything that we learn. Think about this. If on anything that we learn, it's going to require deliberate effort to accomplish. It's not just going to happen. We're going to have to put forth the deliberate effort, the intentional. It's not accidental, it's not magical, it's not automatic. We have to be like Paul. We have to learn. So whether it's in the context of I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me, meaning that I can fulfill any command, any trial, I can do anything that God requires of me, I can meet any temptation, I can live in whatever the circumstances of life that find me, I can do it in Christ. I can. That's the attitude. Now, since God commands us to control ourselves, then we can do it. He commands it. Is he commanding something that we can't do? No, he's commanded it. We can do it. Not only can we do it, we must do it. Again, we said a moment ago, it's not an option. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. And because he's commanded it, it's something we can do. Because it's a command, we must do it. So, we can say no to the things that we need to say no to. You know, I hope you remember maybe in another earlier study, who is the most difficult person to say no to? Us, self. It's hard to say no to anybody, but let me tell you, it's even harder to say no to self. So we can say no to the things that we need to say no to. We can refrain. We can stop doing the things that we ought not to be doing. We can stop. We can. We can. And this gets back to our Bible study on Sunday morning. We can, even though it's a restless evil and a deadly poison, we can bridle our tongues. We can. And we can quit what we know to be wrong. We can make ourselves do what we know we need to do. Someone read it, James 4, verse 17.
Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do, to him it is sin.
Okay, we know what to do, but we don't do it. What did James identify that to be? Sin. If we know to do good and don't do it, we sin. So we can make ourselves do what we know we need to do. We know that we can do that which is good, letting God define what is good. That's why we need to search the scriptures so that we can approve those things that are of God, the good, the excellent things of God. We can do without some things that we may desire and want. We can. And we can overcome the wrong habits and practices that we have learned and developed. We can. So, God commands us to control ourselves. We can do it. We need to have this attitude. But you know, a person that begins with a defeated attitude, he's not going to make the effort to discipline himself. If he has a defeated attitude, I can't, then he's not going to make the effort to deny self. Sometimes when facing a challenge, somebody will say things like, well, you know, I just don't know if, whatever it is, you know, that they're talking about. I just don't know if. Or they say things like, you know, I'll try, but I don't think I can do it. Well, guess what? You're not going to do it. Or somebody might say, you know, it's just so hard for me to, whatever it is that they're having reference to. See, these are statements of attitudes that are defeated before they start. They've already defeated themselves. They know they ought to, they know they should, they know they must, but they don't have I can. They have the attitude that it's just too hard. I'll try, but I don't think I can. You know, if we begin with the attitude that we can control ourselves, that will lead to an I will. If I can, I will. It will lead to an I will attitude. Somebody read us Hebrews 6 and verse 3.
This we will do, God forbid.
All right? This we will do. So there is the I can attitude that will lead us to the I will do. So if we have the I will attitude, that's going to involve determination on our part. And with that attitude, we will master self. We will deny self. So that's one thing absolutely necessary in developing self-discipline, denying self. I can do it. Another thing in developing self-discipline is to refuse to dwell on what we need to deny. See, we're dwelling on the things that we need to be denying self. What are we doing dwelling on those things? So that's something that's necessary. We need to refuse And that's going to involve some self-control, isn't it? Controlling, because this gets us back to what we've been talking about in other lessons. You know, too often we dwell on things that we can't do. We dwell on things that we can't afford. And we dwell on things that we don't need. But we dwell on them. We think about them. They consume our minds, our thinking. We spend time thinking about how we would like to get even with somebody. But we know all the time that we're thinking about wanting to get even, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be getting even. Remember Romans 13? Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Romans 13 and Romans 12. 12, all right, Romans 12. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So we know that. But yet we still dwell on and think about how we would like to get even with someone. We may focus on the fun we think we are missing by living right. I think this is one particularly true of the younger we are. We see the world around us and the things that the world is doing. As we get older, we know we can't do it because we're too old. But when we're young, we begin to look at the world around us and we begin to dwell on the fact that, well, look at what I'm missing. And why am I missing it? Because I got to do the right thing. But still, we think about it. We dwell on it. We think about all of the fun that we think that we're missing out on by living right. And we may think about things that we would like to say that we shouldn't. We think about those things. We think within ourselves, oh, I just wish I said that. And we dwell on them. And these things consume minutes and hours and days and weeks in our lives. Ungodly fantasies may camp out in our minds. So we need to realize that it's hard to window shop without either buying something or making ourselves miserable. And that's what our thinking does. When we're thinking about things that we don't need to be thinking about, in effect, we're window shopping. And the result is we're either going to give in to what it is we're thinking, or we're going to end up making ourselves one miserable person. So the answer is this: we must control our thinking. That's what this whole point about being able to develop self-discipline. And we, like I said, we've spent a lesson already talking about how important our thinking is and how we need to control ourselves when it comes to our thinking. You know, because we know that outward sin comes from our thoughts. Outward sins comes from our thinking. Someone read this, Matthew 15, verse 19.
For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornications, theft, false witness, blasphemy.
And I hope we understand, we talked about this in the lesson that we dealt with thinking, because in more places than not in the scriptures, we see the word heart. And like we just see here in this verse, for out of the heart. So I hope we remember in that past lesson that there's only about one, maybe two verses in both the Old and the New Testament that even refer to the heart as the blood pump. All of the other statements made in the Bible concerning the word heart has to do with the mind, that with which we think, that with which we reason. So this is what Jesus is talking about. Out of the heart, out of that which we use to think and to plan and to meditate, out of that comes evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, and blasphemies. So the point is, stop our thoughts before they lead us to sin. That's what Jesus is saying. You see all of these things that are not to be done, don't think about them. You think about them, you're going to do them. Don't think about them. Stop our thoughts. And they will not lead us to sin. We know that lustful thoughts can lead to adultery. I don't think there's a person in the building tonight that what is not familiar with 2 Samuel 11 and what transpired in David's life that led him to commit fornication, to commit adultery with Bathsheba, and all of the things that mushroomed as a result of that. But it was because of the things that he saw with his eyes and he thought in his mind. So he began to plan, he began to plot, he began to think. And we see what it led to. And then, of course, there's that statement that Jesus made. Someone read that for us in Matthew 5, verse 28.
Say to you that whosoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
See, here is what is so dangerous about our thinking. What we are thinking can lead to both mental and physical adultery. That's what Jesus is saying. Where does it happen? Where does it start? In our hearts, in our minds. Even if we just think it in our minds, we've committed adultery. But chances are, if we think it in our minds and we think of it long enough, it will end up being a physical act of adultery. Same is true of this verse. Bitterness and hatred. It can lead to murder. 1 John 3 and verse 15. Someone read that for us.
Whoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him.
All right, again. In our minds, we hate. Okay? In just what we think in our minds, it can result in either mental murder or physical murder. Just because we don't do it doesn't mean that it's not a sin. Just because we don't commit the physical act of adultery doesn't mean it's not sin. Jesus says if it takes place in the mind, it's sin whether you do it or not, physically. What's true of lust is true of hate. It can lead to both being wrong mentally and physically. So see, this principle includes anything. This thinking includes thinking on any and all things that are sinful. We don't need to be thinking about them. They don't need to have room, time in our thinking, in our thoughts. We don't need to be giving place to them. So thinking on any and all things that are sinful is the principles that we're seeing, and hoping to understand just how important that it is that we control our thoughts. We know, we studied this verse, Titus 2 and verse 12, that we're to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. Someone read that verse.
Teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live sober, righteous, and godly in the present day.
All right. So we are to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. And I think in that lesson, we looked at 3 different passages of Scripture, didn't we? We looked at 1 Corinthians 6. We looked at Galatians 5. And we looked at Colossians 3. And we took those 3 different passages and listed all of the different things that truly fit into this category of what Paul is telling Titus to teach, to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. And we saw a pretty, not an exhaustive list, but enough to help us to understand that, yes, here are the things that we need to be denying, because these are the things that constitute ungodliness. These are the things that constitute worldly lust. And instead, we need to live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. So what we're seeing here in Titus is that it also includes things that may be right within themselves. Like, for example, material things that are just beyond our reach. We read this verse earlier, Philippians 4, verse 11, where Paul said, "Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." So, Paul did not have a problem with living beyond his means in reference to material things. And then there's another verse, Hebrews 13 and verse 5. Someone read that for us.
Let your conduct be without covetousness, be content with such things as you have. For he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you.
All right. So our conduct, not only to live soberly, righteously, and godly, but our conduct needs to be without covetousness. And again, going back to Philippians 4, contentment with what we have. Be content with such things as you have. Because that's what we see covetousness being the exact opposite of, is discontent. Not being satisfied, not being fulfilled. Always wanting more. And if we've got the financial means to do it, fine. But we talked about this last week. Sometimes we get ourselves into debt that we cannot pay because we go and spend beyond our means. For not the things that we need, but the things that we want. So, in looking at what we see here, anything, well, did I press too many buttons? Anything can be taken to the excess, anything. We can make anything wrong if we make it so much of a a desire to have, that it reaches that point where that we're not content, where we covet, where we envy, where we're jealous, all of these other things go along with failing to be content. All right? Any questions, any comments so far? I'm not stopped to allow for that, and I'm sorry. Any comment? We've looked at two things to help us to develop self-discipline. I can attitude and being sure that we refuse to dwell on the things that we need to be denying ourselves of. Anything? Okay, let's look at another one. Another thing in developing self-discipline. Think before we act. And I don't know of a better example for us to see that in than Joseph. Joseph is an excellent example of a person who thought before he acted. And we're familiar with the story in Genesis 39. Well, we're familiar with the story of Joseph, but Genesis 39, he has been taken into Egypt. Potiphar has seen what an amazing, remarkable young man he is, and he puts him in charge over all of his house. But Potiphar's wife makes advances, and she does this repeatedly, over and over, and until finally she grabs him and is attempting to force him to commit fornication with her. And we know that Joseph leaves. He leaves the cloak that he had on in her hand. And of course, she used that against him. When Potiphar got home, she accused Joseph of making the advances. And here you see the evidence of it. He fled and he left his coat. And of course, we know this caused Joseph to be put into prison. But we're familiar with the story of Joseph. So that's what I want us to focus on. When he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, he thought. And sometimes some people say, well, you know, when you're in the middle of being tempted, you can't think. Well, yeah, Joseph is our example. Look at what he thought. Verse 9 of Genesis 39. Someone read that for us.
Then how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?
All right. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? You know, he would have only committed fornication with Potiphar's wife. So the sin would have been there, but Joseph understood about sin. Joseph understood something about sin that a lot of Christians and a lot of people don't understand. Any sin is against God. No matter who we do it with, no matter who we participate with, ultimately, all sin is against God. And that's what Joseph understood. And that's what he thought when here the temptation is before him. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And then there was something else he thought about. Let's go back up and read verse 8, someone. Verse 8 and 9.
He refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has in my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from you, because you are his wife."
See, another thing that Joseph thought about was Potiphar. Potiphar has put him in charge of all of his house. Potiphar has obviously great respect, great appreciation, great honor for Joseph. And Joseph knows that if he commits adultery with Potiphar's wife, he's going to betray all of that. He's going to destroy all of that. So see the two things that Joseph thought about when right in the very midst of this temptation to commit fornication, he thinks about the wickedness of the sin. He thinks about it being a sin against God, and he thinks about it being a sin for him to do against Potiphar, who has trusted him, who has entrusted him with everything in his house. Joseph understood that, but he understood the one thing that wasn't entrusted to him, and that was Potiphar's wife. So,
That tells a story on Potiphar too.
yes, it
He
does.
didn't put much confidence in what Joseph had to say, which it tells a story on him.
Yes, it does. So you see, Joseph's thinking led him to controlling himself and doing the right thing. I know the time is about up, but I want to say this as we bring our study, and you can mark your places at B part on your outlines. We sometimes excuse ourselves by thinking, I just can't think calmly when I'm in the heat of the matter or the heat of the situation. I can't think calmly when I'm in the heat of the situation. How would you like to say that at the judgment day and look Joseph in the face? How would you like to say that? I just can't think calmly when I'm in the heat of a situation or the heat of the matter. And look Joseph in the face. I don't think we'd be too willing to do that, would we? See, Joseph thought things through calmly in the heat of the matter. Now, if he can, we can. That's what I hope is the point that we come away with this example. Time's up. If Joseph can think calmly, we can do it. Thank you so much for our time. And again, mark your places there we'll look at a statement that David makes there in Psalms, the 119th chapter.